Thousands have been killed, many more have been displaced, but the conflict in eastern Ukraine is showing no signs of ending. Now Russia's president is talking about statehood in the east. So, what are Vladimir Putin's plans for eastern Ukraine, and will NATO step in? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. It's been several months since fighting began in eastern Ukraine, and as the conflict has intensified, so have the mutual accusations. The Ukrainian government has long accused Russia of funding and arming separatists in its eastern region. That's of course something that Moscow rejects, with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying his country will not intervene in Ukraine. But now he's called on Ukrainian troops to leave the east, where he says they're at risk of causing harm to the civilian population. As all sides swap blame, the big question for many is, what are Russia's plans for eastern Ukraine? President Putin has repeatedly said he doesn't want to see the breakup of his neighbour, just greater autonomy for eastern Ukrainians. But on Sunday, he made comments that seemed to suggest something entirely different. For the first time, Putin used the word statehood.
Substantive, meaningful talks concerning not only technical issues, but also related to the issues of society's political organization and statehood in southeastern Ukraine should begin immediately in order to protect the legitimate interests of people living there.
Well, almost as soon as Putin made those remarks, his presidential spokesman was quick to pedal back, saying his boss was calling for more dialogue, not sovereignty. So, plenty to discuss here, and joining us to do just that are our three guests. From Moscow, we have Pavel Felgenhauer, defence analyst and columnist with Novaya Gazetta. From London, we're joined by Kadri Liik, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, from Kiev, Alexei Garan, professor of politics at Kiev Moheela University and author of several books on Ukrainian politics and on Ukraine-Russia relations. Welcome to you all. We'll get onto this issue of statehood and indeed NATO in just a moment. But first, let's just assess the current situation on the ground in the east of Ukraine. Kadri Liik, if we could start with you. The tide has certainly turned on the battlefield. Separatist militia were on the ropes a week ago. Now they've very much taken control, haven't they?
Well, in certain areas, yes. You could see that the Ukrainian army was making powerful progress against the separatists, and that forced Moscow to step up its engagement. Moscow denies it has sent any soldiers and weaponry there, but that is in fact fully very well documented. There have been satellite images of tanks crossing over to Ukraine, and some Russian paratroopers have been caught and captured in Ukraine, as well as there are messages about paratroopers having gone to Ukraine from Russia and some being brought back in coffins. So yes, there has been distinct escalation by Russia.
And Alexei Garan, Ukraine in the West, it seems, is in no doubt the hand of Russia is responsible for the upturn in the rebels' fortunes in the East.
Yes, definitely. I don't think anyone in the West has much doubt about it. Russia wants to portray it as an intra-Ukrainian conflict, but even Russia doesn't really put too much effort into making that claim plausible. They are quite happy for that to be an implausible claim.
Alexei, what's your view on the current situation on the ground?
Well, actually, I agree that this is direct Russian intervention, military intervention. There's enough proofs of that. And I would say that no serious commentator and analyst could deny that. Unfortunately, there are some politicians in the West who are trying to deny it, in line with Russian propaganda. And definitely it changes the situation, because now Ukrainian army is to fight with regular Russian troops, which is not easy. So actually we are asking now from Europe and from the US to supply enough military equipment to Ukraine for defense purpose.
Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow, Ukraine, it's clear, is certainly not capable of winning this war alone, is it?
Well, what was most likely clear, at least to me and many others from the beginning, that military defeat by the rebel forces was not acceptable to the Kremlin, and President Putin in the last run would do what it takes to prevent such a military collapse. Apparently, the Ukrainian leadership and their military commanders did not take that fully into consideration and did several very stupid military strategic decisions. They tried to push past the rebels and cut them from the Russian border, thinking that if they occupy the Russian border, supply of men and materials will cease and the fighting will cease. And as a result, they exposed themselves for a very punishing Russian attack. When the Russian troops crossed the border, they just simply cut the Ukrainians into pieces. And right now, there's up to maybe at least 500,000 Ukrainians were taken prisoner and now are being handed back without their weapons to the Ukrainian authorities. So yes, this is a military defeat right now for Ukraine, but Russia is not actually using all of the power military power it could use. Russia is, of course, much stronger than Ukraine militarily. Its military is better organized, but we are not. I mean, there are thousands of Russian troops, most likely. I mean, that's claimed to be in Ukraine, but not tens of thousands that could have been there. The Russian Air Force is still not really engaged in the activity, so this is not a full-scale invasion. This is a balancing act to push back the Ukrainians.
Okay, so that's the position on the ground.
Let's establish a peace.
Okay, let's move it on. Kadri Liik, what about this mention of statehood by Vladimir Putin? If that is indeed what he means, it really does raise the stakes considerably, doesn't it?
No, I don't think so. He used the words that can be translated and interpreted differently. But I think what he means is not making Eastern Ukraine an independent state or annexing it and merging it to Russia the way they did with Crimea. I think he's still talking about arrangements that would be essentially intra-Ukrainian, either federalization of Ukraine, some sort of autonomy to Eastern Ukraine. It's basically, as I see the situation, I think Moscow's ultimate aim is to keep Eastern Ukraine under its own political control, but inside Ukraine, so that this region can be used effectively as a leverage over the rest of Ukraine, in particular to control the country's moves towards NATO or the EU or any other alliance that Moscow doesn't want it to be joining.
And so, Alexei, what's your view? The truth is that he probably doesn't mean statehood, because this phrase that people have been using, this so-called frozen conflict, would suit him better, wouldn't it, to enable this land route through to the Crimea?
Well, I agree that basically what Putin would like, he would like to create huge Transnistria, large Transnistria within Ukraine, and by doing that, he would like to have leverages on Ukrainian politics. He do not want Ukraine to become successful European state, and that's why he would like to have this frozen conflict. But I would like to stress also that now we are discussing what are Putin's plan. But let me say again, this is direct Russian aggression, and Russia has crossed all the possible red lines. As my Moscow colleagues said, Ukrainians did military mistakes. But look, we didn't decide to fight with Russia. We didn't want Ukrainian-Russian war. And what Putin is doing, actually, he's sending his troops against Ukraine. So it's now Ukrainian-Russian war. And the so-called separatists, they didn't have enough support even in Donbass. Without direct Russian intervention, they would lose very, very soon. So I believe now it's very important for international community not to be silent about this act of aggression, but to think how to counter this aggression. Because actually Mr. Putin is behaving like one leader behaved on the eve of 1930 of World War II. And actually we have this discussion on September 1st, the date when the World War II started. So now I think it's very important to urge the Western countries not to continue the appeasement policy. And as of now, it looked very much as an appeasement policy.
Okay, Kadri Liik, I can see. Kadri, let me bring in Kadri Liik. I can see you want to come in.
Excuse me, I would like.
I'll come back to you in just a second. Kadri.
No, I think the West is not being silent. I think many Western leaders are calling a spade, but it's really hard to translate that into action. The West doesn't really know what to do. It is not ready to engage in direct military conflict with Russia in Ukraine. It has imposed sanctions on Russia, but these do not seem to work the way the West intends. Actually, they were never going to. Sanctions can actually erode economic basis of the Russian regime over longer term, but they were probably never going to make Mr. Putin reverse his strategy and tactic in the Ukrainian conflict that we are dealing with right now. So the West is increasingly helpless. We could see how Germany was trying to find some sort of settlement and give Russia a face-saving way out, but Russia was not interested in saving a face. Russia was still interested in achieving its goals, the ones that we talked about earlier, control over Ukraine via eastern Ukraine. So the West really lacks a viable strategy for dealing with that conflict right now.
Okay, let's move on to this issue of NATO. And there is a NATO summit in Wales, of course, at the end of the week. Ukraine, not a member, but it it wants to be in that. Pavel Felgenhauer is the last thing that Russia would want, isn't it?
Oh, that's absolutely unacceptable for Moscow. And actually, I should say that just recently, just an hour or so ago, the rebels in Donbass announced their official negotiating position in the coming negotiations in Minsk. And they say that they don't want independence, that they want to remain part of Ukraine, but want a special status. That's going to be constitutionally inbuilt, and of course they want the Ukrainian troops to withdraw from all the territory of Donbass and of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. So that's just simply is now official that the Moscow apparently made substantial changes in the leadership of the rebels, removed those who wanted to join Russia, and right now is pursuing a policy of kind of one state, two systems, Hong Kong policy for part of Ukraine. So that to anchor Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence by making a part of Ukraine a special entity, which most likely would have veto powers over joining NATO, over joining European Union, over special trading arrangements. So that's clearly right now the Russian political strategic goal in this conflict. And under such conditions, Russia is ready to cease the fire.
Okay, so Kadri Liik, what about the more immediate situation? It's reported that David Cameron will reveal the formation of a new joint force at Cardiff at the NATO summit. What immediate involvement may there be for NATO, do you think, if any?
I think the force that you mentioned will not be directly linked to the situation in Ukraine. I mean, it is, of course, inspired by what is happening in Ukraine, but this one will be still designed for NATO's own existing members. I'm not sure that NATO will do anything very meaningful in Ukraine apart from statements. But it is undoubtedly a grave situation for NATO because it basically calls into question the whole principle of post-Cold War European order, namely that countries are free to choose their own alliances and they can join when they qualify. That has been the underlying principle of much of what has happened during the last 20-25 years, even if it's idealistic. And Russia has never properly accepted it, and now it's challenging it in Ukraine. And it's very hard, really, to defend the principle. It would be easier even to defend the Ukraine and accept Ukraine into NATO. But to make Russia to subscribe to that sort of principle of international life is going to be very hard indeed.
And Alexei Garan in Kiev, what are your thoughts? Do you think that NATO action will simply be restricted to statements?
No, again, as I have said, what we need from NATO, we need supply of military equipment. That's what we need. We need defense equipment.
But that's what you say you need, but is that what NATO will provide, realistically?
Okay, excuse me. May I say that in 1994, Ukraine got rid of its nuclear arsenal, which was the third largest in the world, British, Chinese, and French combined together, in exchange for so-called assurances, security assurances for territorial integrity of Ukraine. And it was signed by the US, the UK, and Russia. So now everything is violated, everything. So my question to the West, how the West is going to react? Basically, we Ukrainians, we know what to do. We are going to defend our country against Russia. And I would like to say, this is not Ukrainian conflict. This is Russia-Ukrainian war. We should be clear about that. And we shouldn't talk about rebels. They are terrorists who are killing and who are killing civilians, including, remember the Malaysian aircraft. So they're kidnapping, torturing people, and they are supported by Russia. So again, we are Ukrainians are fighting, and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are dying every day. The question is to the West, how the West is going to react, how the West is going to secure assurances it had given to Ukraine in 1994. That's a huge question, and I believe now it's time for the West not to talk about some pragmatism or economic things or even effectiveness of economic sanctions and Russian reaction, but about values. What are the values? If you do really believe in the so-called European values, Ukrainians now are dying for values.
Okay, Pavel Felgenhauer, what do you make of that? We're not talking about rebels, we're talking about terrorists.
Well, I mean, calling names does not solve the problem. Rebels is a neutral term that can be used in this kind of circumstances, because this is a more kind of this is right now we're talking about a regular war, not a terrorist attack, but a regular war between different armies, one supported by Russia, the other Ukrainian, supported by the West. And the problem is right now to find the way to stop the fighting, because actually ceasefire, I believe, is in the interest of everyone. And Ukrainians too, even if the Ukrainians want to defend their country, okay. But they
Alexei, certainly come in. Pavel, I'll come back to you in a second. Alexei just wants to make his point.
Excuse me, may I intervene? Yeah, I think this is a repeat actually of Putin's propaganda, and I'm really surprised by what Pavel is saying, because I know him as a very serious analyst. One side is supported by Russians, the other side is supported by the West. Come on, guys. The Western countries are not sending their arms marching into Ukraine. The Western armies are not supplying military stuff to Ukraine to kill civil people. I'm really sorry to say about that. Let's do not go into cynical arguments of Putin's propaganda. I'm sorry for this emotional tone, but I think it's really important to call aggressor, aggressor, to call terrorist, terrorist, and to call Russian war against Ukraine Russian war, not just domestic Ukrainian conflict.
Okay, very briefly, Pavel Felgenhauer, would you like to respond to that? Very briefly.
I just want to say that there's a ceasefire could be in everyone's interest. If Ukrainians want to defend their homeland, okay, but they have to build a military to do that, and that will take years to do, at least several years. And using a military that's badly organized, well, we see how it's been used for the last several months. So right now, a ceasefire should be achieved, and the terms of the ceasefire have been more or less clear. That means a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of Donbass. That's a very, very a pill the Ukrainians won't easily swallow, many in Ukraine, I understand that. But continuing to fight is not most likely an option, because if it need be, Russia can escalate and escalate till Ukraine cannot stand on its feet anymore.
Okay, let's bring in Kadri Liik again in London. The truth is, Kadri, there's no easy way out of this, is there?
Yes, I agree with our Ukrainian colleague about the moral dimension he pointed out. It's true that the Western countries were parties of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and there were certain assurances given. And I think these things will come back to the West. I think not following up its commitments, even if these were not binding, will in the future seriously hinder the capability of the United States to shape any sort of order, global or regional. I think we will pay for it, but that doesn't change the fact that the West lacks a good strategy to intervene in that conflict or even to help to contribute to terms of ceasefire that Ukraine would find acceptable. And it's quite clear that Moscow wants to force its own terms to Ukraine, and Pavel has described those clearly enough.
Alexei, I take it that you feel this threatened ramping up of sanctions will not be sufficient.
When I hear, yes, definitely yes. So when I hear this argument from Russia, give to Putin what he wants. Putin wants Donbass, okay, let's give it to him. The West is not ready to respond, okay. I believe there's a clear comparison with the situation in Czechoslovakia in 1938. And if the West would like to continue in this direction, go ahead.
Okay, so Pavel Felgenhauer, what's your response to that?
Nothing to smile, actually. Nothing to smile, I believe, because a comparison is I believe, is very timely. It's basically the same. Hitler wanted Sudet region, he got it. The West didn't respond. Hitler seized the Czechoslovakia, the West didn't respond because there was a lack of resources. This is fine, very good justification. I'm really surprised that I don't see anti-war demonstrations in Europe. Anti-war demonstrations when you have the war in Europe.
And Pavel, Alexei is making a very good point there. We are, as I say, there's no straightforward way out of this. We are at a very serious, critical, dangerous juncture in this crisis, aren't we?
We sure we are, and de-escalating is very important, and I believe Western leaders want to de-escalate very badly and would actually go to great length and compromise to de-escalate. And most likely Petro Poroshenko would want to de-escalate. At least Putin says that he's ready to use him as a good kind of person with whom he can negotiate. And there's an anti-war demonstration being planned in Moscow this month. We'll see how many people come, but actually polls show that the majority of Russians don't want to fight a war inside Ukraine. So I believe that the groundwork for a possible de-escalation and a ceasefire, maybe it won't be a nice ceasefire, but a ceasefire and some kind of negotiations and moving this from this the brink of a precipice is paramount, and everyone should work in that direction.
It was certainly a changing, fast-moving situation. We'll see how things develop in the coming days, weeks and months ahead. But we have no more time now, unfortunately.
May
we appreciate
I ask
very
Pavel
much.
one thing?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time now, sir. But thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Indeed, to all three of you, Pavel Felgenhauer, Kadri Liik, and Alexei Garan. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you for watching. You can let us know your thoughts by leaving your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Nick Clark. From me and the team here, bye for now.